Hi friends, I hope you're doing great. Today we're going to focus on two simple but very important things. One is when as teachers we're supposed to stand up and when we're supposed to sit down in the class. And the second one is when to use students' first language or L1. Well, I'd like to give you some rules of thumb, and I think if you just keep them in mind, it's really very easy to know when to sit and when to stand up. Sometimes teachers need to be the center of the attention in the class. Sometimes teachers need to be in the foreground because they're giving information to students. Giving information to students could be when you're teaching something, whether you're explaining something, whether you're activating students' background knowledge, whether you're teaching vocabulary, you're teaching grammar, or you're asking questions, you're eliciting information. You are the center of attention. You are in the foreground. In that case, the teacher needs to be standing somewhere appropriate in the class. And when I say standing somewhere appropriate, probably the most appropriate place is right in front of the board, where he or she has access to the board, so you can write things on the board if necessary, and therefrom you can see everyone in the class. Because if you just take a few steps forward and stand in the middle of the class, there will be students in the sides who won't be able to see you, and you won't be able to keep eye contact with them. So it's important that you stand up and explain things, stand up and ask questions, stand up and write things on the board, and position yourself in a place where everybody can see you clearly. You can also see everyone. It's also important for teachers to stand up and do the monitoring when people are working in pairs in the class or they're working in groups, especially if you've asked them to stand up and do the activity, which is very important because from time to time we need to ask students to sit, or from time to time we need to ask them to stand up and work. If they're seated for a long time, they may get tired, physically there may be some pressure on them. But if you ask them to stand up from time to time, like every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes, to have a pair work, to have a group work while standing, speaking with their friends, that pressure on their body will be relieved, and they'll be able to concentrate on the lesson a little bit better. So when students are standing and they're speaking with each other, you as a teacher need to monitor them, and you'd better stand up and approach the learners, listen to them carefully. Sometimes you need to help them, sometimes you need to listen silently and take notes of their problems and errors for correction and for giving feedback. Now, when is a teacher supposed to sit? It's when students are the center of attention. Well, sometimes we ask students to work on something individually. Like, we want students to read a piece of text. It's a reading comprehension passage, for instance. Or we want our students to listen to something as we're playing an audio file in the class. Well, teachers standing here will be a source of distraction. So when students are reading a passage silently, when they're listening to an audio file, the teacher needs to sit and refrain from making noise, because otherwise students would be distracted and they wouldn't be able to do what they're supposed to do with attention. So this is about when to stand up and when to sit in the class. It's also important that a teacher sits when students are sharing their ideas with everybody in the class. Imagine you've asked a question and you want 3 or 4 of the students to share their opinions with everyone in the class. One person speaking and everyone else in the class, including the teacher, listening. In that case, if you're standing and the other student is speaking in the class sitting, you'll be the center of attention because you're standing, and the other person who's speaking won't be heard actually, because students will not know whether to look at the person who's speaking or to look at you, especially if the teacher is taking notes while the other student is speaking in the class, or the teacher is writing something on the board when one of the learners in the class is speaking. So when students want to talk, it's better that you also sit for a few seconds, for a few minutes, and let people share their ideas with everyone in the class. I said it's when one student speaks and the rest of the people in the class listen. So the teacher also sits and gives the floor to the students who's speaking, or to students who take turns and they speak. Other than that, it's important that the teacher stands in the class, walks around the class, and checks if students are on the right track, if they're doing what the teacher has asked them to do, if they need help. If you're sitting, you won't be able to check what students are doing. Imagine you've asked them to take notes. If you don't monitor them, you won't see if students are doing the task properly, or no, they're busy doing something else. Now, another point is when to use students' first language. Well, it's a privilege when teachers and students share the first language. Imagine all your students come from the same first language background, and you also share the same first language with your learners. This is an opportunity because you can use the first language of the learners from time to time, especially when there is a cultural thing you're discussing, or when there is a problem students have expressing themselves in English in the second language, but because you share that first language with them, you understand what they're trying to say, so you can actually help them with giving them the right phrase, the right expression, or mentioning cultural points. So using first language in the class isn't bad, but it's a double-edged sword. I'll let you know why I think so. Well, our students usually have limited exposure in our EFL context to English language, which means usually they have limited time for speaking and for interaction in the class. Well, everyone nowadays has access to social media. They can watch English movies, they can listen to podcasts. So exposing one to English, natural English isn't really very difficult, but still in EFL context there is limitation. There are restrictions for students who want to practice speaking. In our context, in our EFL context, not a lot of people do speak English outside classroom. No matter how hard students immerse themselves in English by listening to different podcasts, by watching English movies, they need to have somewhere to practice speaking skills as well. And in our context, this somewhere is the class they attend, the English class that they attend once, twice, at most 3 times a week. So it's very limited. And there are like 8 students in a class, sometimes 10 students, sometimes more. And part of the class time is the teacher's time, because he or she explains things. So students only have limited chances for practicing their speaking. Sometimes they speak to their friends, sometimes they speak with the teacher. But if you just want to put all their speaking time together, you'll see that they don't have much chance of speaking in the class. So in order to maximize their speaking opportunity, we try to minimize our use of L1 in the class. Not because using L1 is bad, because they are in an EFL context where they don't have many opportunities to practice speaking English with other people. So the reason we say let's not use L1 in the class unless really necessary and only for a few seconds, for clarification purposes usually, is because we want to maximize our students' interaction in the class in English. That's the reason. Well, sometimes when you teach beginners, true beginners, they get desperate. Even if you want to use simple English, sometimes they don't understand simple key terms. And like using a word in Persian would help them understand the lesson better. So you just try to strike a balance between the use of L1 and exposure of students to L2 in the class, with a focus on using L2 in the class so that your students also get used to using L2 in the class rather than L1. Apart from helping beginners, true beginners, and sometimes false beginners, elementary learners at early stages with L1 support, we recommend not using L1 in the class because there are better ways of encouraging students to practice speaking English and understand what you're explaining through using visuals, through giving examples. Make sure that if you use L1 in the class, students will not bother to express themselves when they're talking about something serious in L2. They'll know shifting into L1 will do the trick. So when they can't express themselves in English, they'll easily switch into speaking Persian in the class, and that will result in their learning English with difficulty. I mean, we know that the way through becoming a fluent speaker in English or in any other foreign language is through speaking. Like, if you don't speak, if you don't practice speaking in the class as a learner, you will never be able to be a capable language speaker. You may improve other skills like listening, like reading, like writing, but one important way to improve speaking, the direct path to speaking mastery is through speaking. Therefore, we try to encourage our learners to speak English, to express themselves in English whenever possible, so that they would improve many things like pronunciation, like fluency in English, like intonation, etc., etc. So we won't use students L1 in the class unless really necessary, unless this is very difficult. I wouldn't say it's almost impossible for students to know something without translating it. But remember, you give students an inch, they may take a mile. If the teacher is willing to use students' first language in the class, students will not bother to use English when they should in order to learn to speak English. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for watching the video. Again, as usual, your comments and your questions are more than welcome. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll be more than glad to have a follow-up discussion with you on these two topics we discussed today. Thank you.